Well, thank you so much to Oakville Public Library and of course to Oakvillegreen for inviting me to share this talk with you today. I'm going to move quickly because it's probably a little bit long for this time slot, and I want you to know that there is a resource list that goes with this talk. So afterward, for anyone who's interested in any of the papers or references that I've made, I have 3 sheets of information and links that I can share with you, and maybe through the library or Oakvillegreen, or even by emailing me at ckavassalis@gmail.com. So without further ado, let's get started. And I'm really happy that the library and most groups are now starting with land acknowledgements, because I think it's really immensely important that we think about the land that we're on and the traditional peoples that once were here and how they viewed land, not as something to be possessed, but something to be cared for by many people so that it could continue to provide resources for peoples into the future. And that really is sort of key to this talk this afternoon. I want it to be a fresh look at gardening. I want us to change how we look at the plants and species around us. Native plants are really important, and native plants matter. It's a little bit cliche to use that phrase, but I want you to start to think about actually where plants come from today. And I think
okay, so I've lost the sound.
If you drive anywhere in the GTA, you're going to see a lot of invasive species. This happens to be Japanese knotweed along the QEW towards Grimsey. If you drive towards Toronto, you're going to see a plant called kochia and autumn olive, buckthorn, just about everywhere. We are starting to displace the native plants around us at quite a rapid pace. And this is simply not environmentally responsible care for our land or gardening.
I preferred it just from here. This is really scratchy.
Being environmentally sustainable, that's really
that's
key.
Okay.
By definition, environmental sustainability is the responsible interaction with the environment to avoid depletion and degradation of natural resources.
Very good, that thing, isn't it?
To ensure long-term environmental quality. This is my grandchild. This is one of my reasons for wanting the earth to stay healthy for his generation and future generations.
Are we on mute here?
Think about how and why we choose plants. We choose them for 3 general reasons: for food, for function, and fashion. So you need something that maybe will provide shade, or something that's good to play on, or perhaps you need something that'll help be a rain garden to catch the water when it runs off your roof. With so many plants to choose between, I want to focus on why it's so important to choose native plants when possible and appropriate. First, we'll just go over some basic definitions. And these, particularly the definition of native, varies depending on who you're speaking with. But native or indigenous essentially means a species that have evolved in association with other features of a place. They've developed specific and important relationships within a region over time with predators and parasites and herbivores, etc. An exotic or alien or introduced species is one that is coming from outside its normal distribution. Or it may be a cultivar that has absolutely no natural range. And as an example, so a native species would be over here on the right, this Rosa palustris, which is our native swamp rose. An exotic one would be something like mellow yellow hybrid tea, which really has no natural native range. It doesn't exist naturally anywhere. It was created by humans through natural selection and breeding over hundreds of years. Some of these are not problematic, although many we've read to the point where they're pretty useless for things like pollinators. There's so many petals that there's no longer pollen, there's no longer nectar. But then there are things we call invasive alien species. These are exotic species whose introduction likely will do harm or does do harm to the economy, to the environment, or human health. And this is not my definition. This is the definition used by the federal government. Our Canadian Food Inspection Agency is charged with trying to slow the influx of invasive species and to prevent them when they do arrive. So an invasive species, an example would be Rosa multiflora. Now, this one does have pollen, but when it moves into areas, it excludes all other plants, and it does not support the same kinds of native species that our Rosa palustris will. And I'll talk more about that. But I'd like to play a game first. I call it Where in the World. I want you to look at the gardens and imagine, where do you think this garden is? We'll start here. Here's a rose garden. Now, this garden could be at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Burlington. There's a big rose garden there, maybe in a backyard here. In point of fact, this happens to be in Spain. But I could have literally chosen any country in the world, and I could have found a rose garden. From Alaska to South Africa to Switzerland to India, there are rose gardens literally everywhere. We have spread roses far and wide because we like how the flower looks, even though many of these roses were originally developed from Asia to perhaps Northern Africa. How about these gardens? Here's a nursery that specializes in iris and daylilies and a rooftop vegetable garden. Again, you might say, well, gosh, that could be here in the GTA. But in point of fact, this one comes from South Africa. So the fact that daylilies are native to Asia, there are about 16 different species, really, we've just liked them and we have spread them, again, across all the continents. We grow vegetables now across the planet. Oh, here's a garden. It's got in it goldenrod, Joe pieweed, New England aster, sandbar willow, woodland sunflower. Light bulbs might be going off. You say, well, I recognize those. Those are native to Ontario. And you might think this is an Ontario garden, but in fact, this is a rather famous garden in the United Kingdom. And some of you at this point might be saying, now, is there something wrong here? And the answer is yes. We are moving plants around the globe. And the consequences of this is that native plants are being displaced. Gardening is the largest pathway for the intentional introduction of invasive species. And with invasive species has come invasive pests and disease. And it is very difficult to slow this down. Can we predict if something is going to be invasive? Somebody finds a pretty flower in Germany and says, oh, I would like to bring that here. That's $1 billion question. Unfortunately, the nursery industry really does not vet many plants. And sometimes we only discover after decades or even centuries that a plant is a serious problem. Coltsfoot was introduced as a little medicinal plant, and now people think it's actually Ontario native. It is so prevalent in much of the natural lands. When is a plant classified as invasive? Well, there are many disagreements as to when a plant has actually kind of met that threshold, but in general, it means these are plants that show very high reproductive fecundity. That's a big word that just means they make a lot of seeds. Some plants can make hundreds of thousands of seeds for just a small plant. They also tend to have roots that spread, and sometimes even a fragment of those roots, if left in the soil, will continue to propagate. And they're very difficult to control. So there's these criteria that people go through to determine when a plant has kind of crossed over that boundary to become actually harmful. Okay, but it's important to know that all introduced plants have that potential.
Pick up the call, okay?
How do they get here? Well, as I said,
David,
we bring them through our nurseries. Some are accidentally introduced, and some we deliberately introduce, like barberry. So when you get little packets of seeds, there is a little percentage in there that could very well contain something invasive from faraway lands. This was a study done back in 2008, so it's actually quite out of date, and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has not done a new technical report in some time. The graph in the lower left shows you that invasive species are going up, up, up. At the time of this report, Canada had about 4,000 native plants, and about 500 invasive plant species, almost all of which occur here in Ontario. The vast majority of these came through intentional introductions through the nursery trade. Many came through, herbs and that sort of thing. And then a lot of unintentional ones came through our seed and our garden supplies. So either we did it directly or we do it indirectly. A plant that I'm seeing now growing in popularity in Southern Ontario is the tree of heaven, Elianthus altissima. It's a very pretty tree, pretty flowers, nice bouquet. And when it first came, people thought, well, this is great. It grows anywhere and nothing seems to be eating the leaves. And that's part of what makes plants invasive sometimes, is because they lack natural herbivores and parasites and diseases, unless they too are introduced. And that is now what's happening with Tree of Heaven, because following in its footprints is one thing called the brown marmorated stinkbug that happens to love Tree of Heaven. It's one of its host plants. Unfortunately, it also loves a lot of other plants, and it's becoming a serious pest in gardens and crops. Soon to come, and it's not crossed our borders yet, but the spotted lanternfly. Again, the Tree of Heaven is its primary host. It, however, will start to feed on fruit crops and start to do serious damage. So we introduce one plant thinking, okay, it's not so bad, and coming in its wake is a whole wave of other species that will use the plant to multiply and then spread. The cost of invasive plant species is huge. In Canada, we spend about 7.5 billion on agriculture, crops, and forestry to try and keep them in check. But municipalities spend wads of cash trying to eliminate things like buckthorn or giant hogweed, which is now here in Oakville. And some of these have health impacts, so people can get badly scarred by the saps from the giant hogweed. We are now getting a big insurgence of ticks. And it's a very curious fact. They don't know quite why, but it turns out that Japanese barberry, an invasive species that we've introduced, contains 3 times more deer ticks infected with Lyme disease. So why Lyme disease is higher in Japanese barberry, we don't know, but it may have to do with some of the checks and balances that occur in natural systems. There are ecological impacts, ecosystem services lost, and incalculable loss of native species. And one of the big losses of native species I'll talk about shortly is the loss of insects. Native plants are anchors in healthy, biodiverse ecological communities. And remember, these native species are members of an assemblage of organisms. They've evolved together. There are predation, parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, all of these relationships that keep food webs and ecosystem functions and services going. And when we start plucking out species or reducing them, we get whole collapses of these systems. You look at a beautiful garden like this one, which could be anywhere in Oakville, full of boxwoods and peonies and lawns. And you should know that this is essentially a food desert. In fact, non-native species are second only to direct habitat loss as a cause for the decline and extinctions of species across the planet, according to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Ecosystems, species, wild populations, local varieties and breeds of domesticated plants and animals are shrinking, deteriorating, or vanishing. The essential interconnected web of life on Earth is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. The loss is a direct result of human activity and constitutes a direct threat to human well-being in all regions of the world, even here in Ontario. The World Wildlife Fund has been mapping the population sizes of various mammals, birds, amphibians, and reptiles. And what they have noted is an alarming drop, 68% since 1970. These trends signal a fundamentally broken relationship between humans and the natural world. We're creating winners and losers, some really big winners and some really big losers, and a lot in between. And that's bad, says macroecologist Dr. Brian McGill. If you think about it, we have created lawns. Lawns are now the largest irrigated crop in North America. We spread them out, just vast amounts of them. And then we wonder why Japanese beetles are so prolific. We've simply rolled out the dinner plate and said, come on, come on. And so it's causing this huge imbalance in what's occurring. 60 European starlings were introduced in New York in 1890, and now there are over 200 million of them. So again, really big winners. And then some, like our rusty patch bumblebee, which is almost at extinction. It's disappearing. And insects are disappearing across the globe. The average decline, according to a recent meta-analysis, is about 9% per decade. And those of you who are my age and older will remember the days when you drove down the road, you had to use your windshield wipers because there were so many dead bugs on the windshields. And now I hardly see any. My garden is really quiet. And going with that disappearance of insects is all the things that are connected with them. North American birds have dropped by 3 billion since 1970. 3 billion, that's a hard number to get your head around. That's 29% gone in 50 years. That's 60 million a year, 164,000 a day. Imagine if you lost $164,000 from your bank account. Oh, that's daily. And one of the things is that there are really great people like Dr. Doug Ptolemy, who's an entomologist and wildlife ecologist for the University of Delaware. And he's been looking at, what is this relationship between insects and birds? And looking at chickadees, he's found that just to rear a clutch of baby chickadees, they have to catch between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars in about 16 days. That's like 400 caterpillars a day. That's an immense number. And yet as gardeners, we tend to eschew anything that gets holes in the leaves. And the first thing people want to do is ask me, how do I get rid of, how do I spray this? How do I stop this? But insects are key to ecosystem health. The insects are kind of fundamentally at the base of this huge pyramid. They are herbivores. They eat both weeds and they're also predators. They eat each other. They're good pest control agents. They help to purify water. They are a food source for birds and other creatures. They cycle nutrients. They help degrade leaves that hit the ground and create soil. So they are serving all these kinds of functions within ecosystems. And of course, there are pollinators, which are necessary for our crops and all flowering plants. Human health requires that we keep these ecosystems and ecosystem functions healthy. The January Journal of the North American Science Association dedicated the entire journal to the death by 1,000 cuts, what's happening with insects. And one of the articles in there was, how can we stop this trend? Because it really is serious across the globe. And what they came up with surprised me and may surprise you, because it really comes down to changing how we garden. Convert lawns into natural, diverse habitats. Reduce pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. Limit exterior lighting. Become an educator, ambassador, advocate for insect conservation. Get involved, support science, and vote for legislators who are going to make changes. And big one, grow native plants. And they didn't put it in there, but I'm going to add, avoid invasive plants, because in fact, that's the biggest threat to native plants. When you have a native landscape versus a traditional one full of exotic species, you will have 50% higher abundance of native birds, 9 times higher abundance of rare birds, 3 times more butterflies, 2 times more native bees. These studies have been done by Cornell, by University of Massachusetts, over and over again. We're seeing significant differences between native and non-native species. Even within the same genera, same group of plants, the oaks versus and the cherries and the maples, native oaks are twice the caterpillar density as non-native ones. And as some of these species, for instance, the oaks, cherries, maples, and basswoods have hundreds of caterpillars that will feed on them, whereas some of these introduced ones, like the ginkgo tree, may have just one, and maybe not even a native one. We need to aim for less than 30% non-native plants. That is, a chickadee requires 70% native plant biodiversity to sustain populations. And I think if any of you walked through Oakville and you look down your street, I know at least in my street this is the case, there are no lawns, properties in my neighborhood that have met that 70% native plant biomass, and that's scary. When we choose exotic species, native flora decreases. With decreased native flora, decline in fauna, birds, bees, and butterflies. So people like periwinkle. It has a pretty blue flower, and they say, but I can see pollinators love it. Well, if you look closely, you'll probably notice that the pollinator is not native, but it may be something like the European honeybee, which is a domesticated species, and in some cases invasive. It's displacing native species. Something like Japanese barberry as well, displacing natives. Barberry, they've done a lot of studies on because it's not a huge problem here as much as it is now in the United States, particularly Connecticut and New Hampshire, where it has been released. Canada actually tried to slow the influx of barberry so that it hasn't become quite a problem, but that's changing. Barberry doesn't have many herbivores, so there's not that many things eating it, which means the predators that eat the herbivores have decreased. The detritivores, the things that eat the leaves in the soil, there's not many things that can turn those leaves into humus and release the nutrients back to the earth. And again, the predators that eat those detritivores are also declining. So again, it's these complex food webs that one plant can be so disruptive and make huge changes. I'm going to be clear, not all exotic species are doing harm. Most of our food crops are exotic species. I'm going to continue to grow apples and peaches because I use them, and they tend not to be invasive. They don't spread into wild lands. Many times when I've given talks like this, people kind of well up or they clench their fist and they say, I'm not giving up my peonies. Well, I'm not asking people to give up their peonies. While they don't support a lot of native biodiversity, they do tend to stay put. But I am going to try and say that going forward, let's try and keep them under 30% and say no to invasive species, the transformers that are really disrupting natural lands. Some people will say, well, it's easy ground cover, nothing else will grow. I keep it contained. These are not excuses that we should support. They are not contained. They are spreading. And even if you, over a short period of time, might be able to keep it contained, if you leave your place and pass it on to future generations, it's going to spread. To learn more about invasive species, I encourage you to visit the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's website. And again, I will provide these all in a separate file if you're interested. Credit Valley Conservation Association has great lists that are helpful. And there are invasive plant atlases and invasive.org that can give you more information. Top ones that are really pretty that I'm seeing still in garden centers are things like goutweed, Himalayan balsam, silverglass, that miscanthus that you see everywhere, Asian honeysuckles. When you go to a nursery to purchase plants, type the name and type the word invasive. See if it's showing up in lists. And if it is, please avoid it. Not all of them are here yet. Many plants have been in the United States longer, and you can see the trends there. With climate change, things that were not as invasive because they were checked by winter temperatures are going to become more and more of a problem going forward, like butterfly bush. So I'm going to put that aside and take a fresh look at gardens. And now think about positive things. How can you plant and renovate for the well-being of generations to come? There are some things you can do. Choose Ontario species. I know, not more native again. Yes, it's going to be native from here on out, because made in Canada and made in Ontario should be things we're looking for. These species that are grown here are important. And it turns out that not all native species are sort of created equally in supporting greater food webs. Work by Doug Ptolemy again has shown that 5% of native plants support 75% of caterpillar food webs. 14% support 90% of our caterpillars. So if we know those key plants, we can make little changes that have bigger impacts. Also, 1/3 of our native bees require a particular set of plants to reproduce, and there are some that do a better job, cover more species than others. And these keystone plants now have been collected by the World Wildlife Federation, and they've made some lists for our eastern temperate region. We live in sort of this Carolinian tree zone, but it's part of a broad eastern temperate zone that goes from Ontario all the way down into the Carolinas. And what they've discovered are the top 5 species: oaks, cherries, willows, birches, and maples. These can support vast numbers of Lepidoptera. By that I mean moths and butterflies. 436 in oak species. In Oakville alone, we have red oak, white oak, bur oak, swamp oak, black oak, chinkapin oak. They're less common. But there's many, many species we can choose from. And by choosing these, we've already changed the balance towards supporting that clutch of chickadees or another bird or another species that's here. Some of our yards can't support large stature trees, but there are native shrubs that can do the same. Maybe not quite so many, but things like blackberry, the beak hazel, dogwoods, serviceberries, all of these are fantastic keystone species that if you don't have a lot of space, you can find them to host butterflies and moths in your yard. Dogwoods, I just looked at the species that occur here. We have 5 species: alternate leaf, gray, red osier, round leaf, silky, and there's one for every condition. The alternate leaf dogwood is sort of an all-round beautiful plant that can fit in most small gardens. But if you have moist soils, I would suggest the gray dogwood. If you've got dry shade, the round leaf dogwood and red osier dogwood looks lovely everywhere. So again, we just need to start looking to maximize the benefit for native species. You can optimize your garden for butterflies. The Halton Conservation Authority has created a list of butterfly host plants. And you can say, okay, I would like to have more skippers in my garden. What do I need to plant? Well, you need to plant native grasses. And you can learn about these things. Native trees and shrubs, let the keystone species be your scaffolding. Those are the majority. And then you can fill it in with some of the lesser known species. The Forest Gene Conservation Association has tremendous resources for you about native plant species. We are in Eco District 7E4, and it will provide a list for you of which plants that you should prioritize over the exotics that you might find. Now, lepidopteras, the moths and the butterflies, those are great to support, but we also have native bees that need supporting because pollinators are in serious trouble. There are about 800 species of native bees in Canada, 400 here in the GTA. Of those, about 150 are what we call specialist species. A specialist species like this little erythronia, Adrena erythronii, on the trout lily, it can only use the pollen from a small set of species in the Erythronium genus that it can support its young. So if there are no trout lilies, that particular bee will disappear. But there are some species that can support kind of a wider number of specialist bees. And Doug Ptolemy, again, has amassed these for our eastern temperate region. And I've kind of honed the list for the Halton area for Oakville. And we find things like sunflowers, goldenrods, asters, black-eyed Susans, tickseed, primrose, sneezeweed, dogwoods. These are great. And honestly, there are wonderful, wonderful flowers in your garden. And just by adding a few of these, you will see a change with how much bee and pollinator activity you have. When you plan your gardens, think from spring to fall. Add a keystone species for each month. Make that a goal. You could add Salix discolor, that's your pussy willow, for March. In April, the alternate leaf dogwood. May, maybe a fleabane. June, black-eyed Susans. For July, you could put in Onothera biennis, some of the evening primrose. In August, one of our beautiful sunflowers. In September and October, the asters and the goldenrods shine, and these are fantastic keystone species for bees. In fact, most people don't even know there are actually 15 native goldenrods here in the Halton region. And you probably see only a few of them. Many are really great in the garden. If you have deep shade, the zigzag goldenrod, that's Solidago flexicalis, or part shade, beautiful Solidago caesia called the blue stem goldenrod. And for more drier, sunnier areas, Solidago rugosa. And if you don't mind things a little bit wilder, the Canada goldenrod or the giant goldenrods are absolutely beautiful. And again, just making a few changes can add more life to your garden. And collectively, together, these link and support species. These are the top 4 keystone species for flowering plants in Oakville: the goldenrods, the sunflowers, the asters, and the black-eyed Susans. This time of year, you can find them lots of places. You can go out and collect seeds. You don't have to spend a lot of money. Winter sow these in your gardens, and next year, enjoy the changes that occur. This fellow, Justin Lewis, is rather new to gardening. He lives in Burlington and wanted to transform his backyard, which was all lawn, into a native plant sanctuary. And this is where he is at this summer. And honestly, his enthusiasm I find infectious, because each day he'll say, oh my gosh, this bird just came to my yard, or this butterfly, or this bee I've spotted. And it was just by selecting keystone species and providing some things like water and various grasses for shelter and protection that made this difference. The change is happening. I was really delighted to see the new gardens that have been planted in front of the Oakville Trafalgar Community Center on Reynolds Street. It is, in fact, full of keystone species. And for those of you just wanting to collect plants to maybe start in your own garden, you could walk through this time of year, collect some seeds, and start your own plants full of dogwoods, full of goldenrods, full of black-eyed Susans, and many native grasses. And in the spring, they have Aquilegia canadensis, our native columbine, and that kind of thing. So they've done a fantastic job creating a keystone garden. When designing with plants, this is where art meets science. You need to do a site assessment. Decide, what do you have? How dry is it? How moist is it? What's your soil like? Is it clay? Is it sand? Do I have shade? Do I have sun? Do I have parched sun? And start making lists of plants that could potentially thrive in those conditions. Make your lists. Then look for inspirational gardens to figure out how you would like to combine them. There are some pre-made garden suggestions for you. Many, in fact, they're growing on the web. Here's one for the rusty patch bumblebee. Now, this is for across Ontario, so it's not Halton specific. So not everything here is actually native to Halton, but close enough. And if you planted a garden like this, with your red columbines in the spring and in the fall, your asters, this would be a lifesaver for a bee that's about to disappear. Many people have trouble with native plant gardens because they find that they look too informal and too wild. This doesn't have to be the case. You can employ structural elements, geometrical shapes, repetition of ideas, symmetry, put evergreens in like Thuya occidentalis and Juniperus communis. Sorry, I'm thinking in the Latin names. That's our native juniper and cedars. And those can automatically make it look more formal. You can cut things, give things what we call the Chelsea chop. When stuff comes up in spring about mid-June, you chop them off half height, and this will make the stem stiffer and reduce the height on them. So for asters and goldenrods, this can be a useful technique. Many of you, when you go to nurseries, you'll find things they call nativars. These are cultivars of native plants. And I'm often asked, is it okay to plant these? Well, yes and no. Some nativars are really simply selections of naturally occurring plants, and some really are so far from being native that they no longer have pollen or nectar. That is, they've worked on them so much that they've doubled or tripled the number of petals coming on them. So again, they don't support much life. But they're doing more and more studies, and because it's becoming more interest, breeders are actually now looking to breed plants that support native species. So there are reasons sometimes to select cultivars. Some offer disease resistance, longer flowering period, more rigid form. But anytime you introduce them, you reduce local gene pools, and you're probably likely to support less wildlife. But ecologists say, gosh, if we move forward to including more natives, don't get religious about it. We don't want to discourage people. Plant a variety of plants that bias towards native or near native species with a selection of exotics that extend the flowering period. I went to the Ercles estate a couple of years ago. I took this photograph there, and this is Celosia argentea, called flamingo feather. It was actually beautiful. And it was absolutely covered with monarch butterflies about to make their transit across the Great Lakes. It was full of nectar and giving them an energy boost as they went across. So particularly for migratory species, some of these exotics can be helpful. Things like blanket flower, ironweed, tickseed, that's the coreopsis that you often see called as native, are not technically native to Oakville, but by including them, you are supporting a wide range of generalist pollinators that are native across the northeastern United States. From perennial beds to the vegetable patch, your garden can be an ecological habitat that's healthy and productive. There's some excellent books by Jessica Walliser on how to attract beneficial bugs to your garden, creating insectaries. And she's got little garden recipes for you. So they're there. You just open the books and you can see what plants to introduce. She's also got a book called Plant Partners, things that you can plant in and amongst your vegetables that can help reduce the invasive pests and some of the native pests that can reduce your crop production, so that we don't have to use as many pesticides or alternative methods. Remember that how you care for your garden throughout the season is really important, even for the exotic species. This picture here in the upper right and lower left, those are from the Anderson Parquet native garden there on the corner of Rebecca and Forsyth. It's, again, it's under construction as is usual, so it doesn't looking its best, but it's a great one to go and see and collect seeds from. But one of the things that we do there and in all these gardens is we do not cut them back in the fall. Leave your seed heads for wildlife. And when you do have to cut things back, chop and drop. Don't take it off your property. Leave the duff and the leaf litter there, because all these moths, butterflies, bees, beneficial insects, fireflies, lacewings, beetles, they need protection. Over the winter, they need to hide in the debris that's under your trees and your plants. If you are sucking it up, blowing it away, sending it away, you are simply killing them. So chop and drop, leave cleanup until late spring when it's required. And if it's not required, simply mulch. It will turn to soil and you'll establish a very healthy assembly of organisms. A note on light pollution. One of the big trends in gardening has to put more lighting in gardens, and a lot of these are solar lights, so they never go off. And more studies are showing that artificial light is reducing nocturnal pollinators, which actually is reducing daytime pollinators, and through a complex relationships, things like fireflies are blinking out. Again, turn off your lights at night, and please don't use artificial lighting when you're not there. Excellent resources online. I'm not going to go through all of these given the time period we have. These will be in the sheets that I can provide for you afterwards. I will say that Credit Valley Conservation Association has created some fantastic brochures that have pictures and lists and times of plants for breeding birds, migrating birds, woodland plants, prairie and meadow plants. Fantastic resources. Unfortunately, they've just redone their website, so things are a little hard to find, but I will send you the links for what I had the last time that I knew where they were. Anyway, good things to search for. When you buy, try to find locally grown and sourced plants. On the Halton Region Master Gardeners site, we have created lists of native plant nurseries. Credit Valley Conservation Authority has their own list of native plant nurseries. You'll find these in several places. These are growing in size, and there are many now that you can simply order online and they'll come to your door. And they are excellent. I've used many of them. Your style can be unique. They don't have to look wild. They can look beautiful and artistic. but you can make whatever design you choose ecologically sound. And this is really the message here. Choose natives, put them in to match your aesthetic style, but remember the bigger picture. We are trying to connect pieces. My friend Claudette Simmons with Alton Master Gardeners broke a pot in her garden and was going to put it together. And she looked at the piece and she thought, what a great metaphor for our lost ecosystem function. We have broken bits of our land so far apart that it can no longer do a lot of the things that it used to be able to do. But we can make a difference by connecting our little pieces of land that we care for. We can shrink our lawns, choose native plants, aim for 70% native plants, focusing on keystone plants, and planting native trees when and where we can. Reject invasive plants, reduce light to preserve insects, and rethink the rules about cleaning up your garden. Don't clean up your garden in the fall. Together, we really can make a difference. And I know that was kind of a whirlwind tour, but I hope that you feel a little inspired and empowered by some of the choices that you have. And I'd be happy to answer some questions now. Thank you very much. And I will close my slides so that we can stop and chat a little bit.